The cabin stood isolated at the edge of an unmarked lake, surrounded by dense, towering pines that swayed in the icy breeze. Ben and Laura had booked it on a whim, eager for a quiet weekend away from the chaos of their city lives. The listing had boasted breathtaking views and total seclusion, but as they drove up the unpaved, winding road leading to the property, Laura couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. The place was older than the photos suggested, paint peeling from the walls, the porch sagging under years of neglect. Still, the lake's stillness was mesmerizing, its surface reflecting the twilight sky in a mirror-like sheen. Ben brushed off her concerns, hauling their bags inside. "It's rustic," he said with a grin. "It'll be fun." Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. The furniture was outdated, the wallpaper curling at the edges. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth cold and gray. Laura ran her fingers along the mantel, brushing off a thick layer of dust. Something about the place felt forgotten. Night fell quickly, swallowing the last light from the sky. Laura busied herself with dinner while Ben stacked firewood, his laughter echoing outside as he wrestled with the stubborn logs. The sound of his voice was a comfort, grounding her in the unsettling quiet of the forest. As they ate, the wind howled through the trees, making the windows rattle in their frames. The conversation turned to work, friends, and life back home, an attempt to drown out the oppressive silence. But midway through dinner, Laura paused, her fork hovering midair. "Did you hear that?" Ben frowned. "Hear what?" She held up a hand, straining her ears. A faint tapping sound, almost imperceptible, seemed to come from outside. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails drumming on glass. Ben rolled his eyes. "It's probably a branch," he said, getting up to check. He swung open the front door, the cold rushing in like a living thing. The porch was empty, the forest beyond a black abyss. He shut the door and locked it, flashing Laura a reassuring smile. "Nothing out there?" he said, settling back into his chair. But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Later that night, they climbed into the creaky bed in the master bedroom, the mattress sagging under their weight. Laura lay awake long after Ben's breathing evened out, her eyes fixed on the shadowy ceiling. The tapping returned, louder this time, coming from the direction of the window. Heart pounding, she sat up and peered through the curtains. The lake glimmered faintly under the moonlight, the trees standing silent and unmoving. But just as she was about to let the curtain fall, something shifted near the water's edge. A figure, pale and indistinct, standing perfectly still. Laura gasped, the sound loud enough to rouse Ben. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, half asleep. "There's someone out there," she whispered. Ben groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. "You're imagining things." She didn't sleep the rest of the night, her ears tuned to every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, Ben dismissed her fears, insisting they spend the day exploring. They hiked around the lake, the air crisp and biting. But Laura couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows shifted in her periphery, and every so often, she thought she heard faint footsteps behind them, too light to belong to Ben. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The fireplace crackled as Ben lit a fire, the warm glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. Laura tried to relax, sipping wine and forcing laughter, but her unease only grew. As the night deepened, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just tapping. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood, echoed from the porch. Ben grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, his bravado faltering when the beam illuminated deep gouges in the wooden railing. "An animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Laura shook her head. "What kind of animal does that?" The answer came hours later when Laura woke to the sound of heavy breathing. She froze, her eyes darting around the dark room. Ben was beside her, sound asleep. The breathing wasn't his. It came from the corner of the room. Her throat tightened as she reached for the lamp on the bedside table, her fingers trembling. The weak light illuminated the room, revealing nothing out of place. But the breathing didn't stop. "Ben," she hissed, shaking him awake. He groaned, sitting up groggily. "What now?" "Listen," she whispered. The breathing had stopped. Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You need to calm down." Before she could respond, a deafening crash echoed from the living room. They both bolted upright, fear electrifying their movements. Ben grabbed the fireplace poker, motioning for Laura to stay put. "Don't," she pleaded, but he was already out the door. The minutes stretched into an eternity as she waited, straining to hear any sign of him. Then the sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, approached the bedroom. "Ben?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open and her scream caught in her throat. It wasn't Ben. The figure was impossibly tall, its face obscured by a burlap sack stack stained with dark, wet streaks. Its shoulders heaved as it stood in the doorway, the room filling with the stench of decay. Laura scrambled backward, her hands fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. The figure took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under its weight. A loud crash from the living room made it stop. It turned its head slowly, as if distracted, before retreating into the shadows. Moments later, Ben stumbled into the room, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "We have to go," he gasped, grabbing her arm. They ran into the night, the forest closing in around them. Behind them, the cabin loomed, its windows glowing faintly. Laura glanced back one last time and froze. The figure stood in the doorway, watching them. In its hand, it held something that glinted in the moonlight, Ben's flashlight. They didn't stop running until they reached the car, the engine sputtering to life as Ben floored the gas. The cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. Weeks later, back in the city, she found a package on their doorstep. No return address. Inside was the flashlight, its lens shattered and smeared with blood. The sun was setting behind the mountains as the winding dirt road came into view. Hannah and her boyfriend Mark had been looking forward to this weekend for months, a remote off-grid getaway in a cabin they'd rented online. It was supposed to be romantic, isolated, and free of distractions. The cabin was even more secluded than they'd expected. The closest town was nearly an hour away, and the surrounding forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. As they approached, the first thing Hannah noticed was how dark it was, even in daylight. The trees crowded together, their gnarled branches like claws reaching toward the sky, blocking out the sun. The cabin itself was small, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. It looked far less charming than the photos on the website. "Rustic," Mark said with a laugh as he unloaded their bags. The inside wasn't much better. The furniture was worn, the air heavy with a musty odor. But Hannah reminded herself that the whole point was to disconnect from the modern world. No cell service, no internet, just the two of them and the quiet of the woods. They spent the first evening settling in, cooking dinner on an ancient gas stove and drinking wine by the fireplace. The isolation was starting to feel more peaceful than unnerving. But as the night wore on, the silence became oppressive. The kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but something deeper, something alive. Hannah noticed it first, the faint scratching noise coming from the back of the cabin. She paused mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Mark shrugged. "Probably just an animal. We're in the middle of nowhere, remember?" She tried to laugh it off, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like claws raking against wood. Mark, annoyed, grabbed a flashlight and went to check. He opened the back door, the beam of light cutting into the darkness. "See? Nothing," he said, stepping outside to look closer. Hannah stayed at the door, watching as he scanned the perimeter. The light swept across the edge of the woods, illuminating only trees and undergrowth. Then, just as he turned to come back, the flashlight flickered and died. "Great," Mark muttered, shaking it uselessly. "Just come back inside," Hannah called, her voice tinged with unease. He stepped toward the door, but his foot froze mid-step. He was staring at something just beyond the tree line, his body rigid. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I thought I saw." His voice trailed off. "It's nothing." But his face was pale when he stepped inside and locked the door behind him. The rest of the evening passed uneasily. Every so often, Hannah thought she heard movement outside. A faint crunch of leaves, a distant snapping branch, but Mark dismissed her fears. They went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Hannah woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. She held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low creaking noise. It was coming from the front porch. She shook Mark awake. "Someone's out there," she whispered. He groaned, but sat up, grabbing the flashlight from the bedside table. This time it worked, casting a narrow beam of light. They crept toward the front door together, Hannah clutching a heavy iron poker she'd taken from the fireplace. The door had a small window, and Mark peeked through it cautiously. He stiffened immediately. "What is it?" Hannah hissed. He turned to her, his face ashen. There's someone standing out there. Her heart plummeted. What do you mean someone? Just standing, not moving. Against her better judgment, she took a quick glance through the window. A figure stood at the edge of the porch, barely illuminated by the weak moonlight. It was tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if studying the cabin. Should we call the police? She whispered, knowing full well they had no signal. The figure took a step closer, and Hannah realized something horrifying. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, its movements eerily smooth and unnatural. Mark yanked her away from the window. We need to barricade the door. They pushed the couch against the door and moved the kitchen table in front of the back entrance. Mark grabbed a knife from the counter while Hannah held tightly to the poker. The figure didn't try to break in. It simply continued to circle the cabin, its movements audible through the thin walls. Every so often, they'd hear a faint tap at a window, as if it was testing the glass. Hours passed, and the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees. The noises stopped. When they finally worked up the courage to look outside, the figure was gone. Relief flooded over them, but it was short-lived. As they packed their bags to leave, Mark found something carved into the wooden doorframe. A single word, etched deeply as if by claws. Stay! They didn't. The wind howled through the dense forest as Emma, James, and their two friends, Rachel and Kyle, pulled up to the remote cabin. They had planned this weekend getaway for months, a chance to escape the city and reconnect with nature. The Airbnb listing had promised tranquility and unparalleled privacy, but as the group stepped out of the car and stared at the dark, looming structure ahead, it felt anything but tranquil. The cabin looked older than they'd imagined, its wooden slats weathered and warped. A single lantern flickered on the porch, casting eerie shadows that danced in the surrounding trees. It's just for the weekend, James said with forced enthusiasm. Let's make the most of it. Inside, the cabin was small and rustic, with a faint smell of damp wood. The electricity flickered as they switched on the lights, and the walls were lined with old photographs of the surrounding forest. Strangely, the faces of the people in the photos were scratched out, leaving only their bodies posed awkwardly against the backdrop. Rachel shivered. Who does that to their photos? Maybe they had a weird sense of humor, Kyle offered, but his voice wavered. The group settled in, cooking dinner and playing board games, but an undercurrent of unease rippled through the night. As the hours passed, the sounds of the forest grew louder, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant howl. Emma was the first to hear it, a faint tapping at one of the windows. She froze, her glass of wine halfway to her lips. Did you guys hear that? Hear what? James asked. But before Emma could answer, the tapping came again, louder this time. Kyle got up to check, pulling back the curtain. It's probably a tree branch, he said, squinting into the darkness. The forest stared back, silent and impenetrable. It's nothing, he said, letting the curtain fall back into place. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved, first to the kitchen window, then to the living room. Rachel clutched Emma's arm. This isn't funny. Who's out there? There's no one out there, James said, but his tone lacked confidence. The group decided to call it a night, retreating to their rooms in uneasy silence. Emma and James took the bedroom upstairs, while Rachel and Kyle stayed in the two downstairs rooms. Hours passed. Emma woke suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was pitch black, the faint glow of the moon obscured by the heavy curtains. She turned to wake James, but froze when she noticed the sound. It was faint at first, soft breathing, not James's, but something heavier, slower, coming from the corner of the room. James, she whispered, shaking him awake. What? He mumbled groggily. Listen. He sat up, his body going rigid as he heard it too. The breathing grew louder, moving closer to the bed. James grabbed his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The weak beam of light swept across the room, illuminating nothing. There's nothing here, he said, his voice shaking. But as he swung the light back toward the corner, Emma saw it, a flash of something pale and gaunt, disappearing into the shadows. Did you see that? She gasped. James didn't answer. He grabbed her hand, and they bolted out of the room, rushing downstairs to wake the others. Rachel and Kyle were already in the living room, and their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. Something's wrong, Rachel said. We heard footsteps in the hallway, but when we checked, no one was there. Before anyone could respond, a loud, guttural thud echoed through the cabin as if something heavy had slammed against the front door. "Okay, we're leaving," Kyle said, grabbing the keys. They piled into the car, but as Kyle turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. "Nothing. Come on," he muttered, panic rising in his voice. The thudding continued, now coming from all sides of the cabin. Something or somethings were circling them. Emma turned to look out the window and immediately wished she hadn't. In the faint glow of the porch light, she saw them, figures standing just beyond the tree line, tall and impossibly thin, their limbs elongated and wrong, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice trembling. James grabbed her arm. "Don't look at them. Just don't look." The figures began to move, their motions jerky and erratic as they crept closer. Rachel screamed as one of them pressed its face to the car window. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over sharp bones, its eyes black and empty. "Run!" Kyle shouted, yanking open the car door. They sprinted toward the woods, hoping to lose the figures in the dense undergrowth. The forest closed in around them, branches tearing at their clothes and faces. The sound of pursuit was deafening, branches snapping, guttural growls, and the heavy thud of footsteps too large to belong to anything human. One by one, the group became separated. Emma clung to James's hand, her breath ragged as they stumbled through the dark. Then silence. They stopped, straining to hear any sign of the others, but all Emma could hear was the pounding of her own heart. "Do you think we lost them?" she whispered. James didn't answer. "James?" Yep. She turned to look at him and screamed. It wasn't James. The figure that held her hand smiled, its mouth impossibly wide, filled with jagged yellow teeth. Emma's scream echoed through the forest, swallowed by the night. The isolated lake house stood at the edge of a sprawling forest, its reflection shimmering in the inky black water. Megan, her fiancé Chris, and their two friends, Lisa and Eric, had rented it for a relaxing weekend. It was miles away from the nearest neighbor. A perfect escape, or so they thought. The group arrived late Friday evening, the last remnants of sunlight slipping behind the trees as they unloaded their bags. The house was quaint but eerily quiet, with creaky wooden floors and an unsettling collection of taxidermy animals lining the walls. "Who decorates like this?" Lisa asked, grimacing at a deer head with cloudy, lifeless eyes. "Maybe it's part of the charm," Chris joked, though his laugh sounded hollow. The first night passed uneventfully, though Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As she stood by the large window overlooking the lake, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the forest, a shadow slipping between the trees. "Probably just an animal," she muttered to herself, shutting the curtain. The next morning, the group spent the day hiking and swimming. By the time evening fell, they were exhausted, sitting around the living room with drinks in hand. Chris suggested a fire pit outside, and they all agreed, eager to enjoy the cool night air. As the flames crackled and sparks danced into the dark sky, Megan felt it again, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She glanced over her shoulder toward the forest. It was still and silent, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Hey, did you hear that?" Eric asked suddenly, breaking the calm. "Hear what?" Megan asked, her voice tight. "Shh." They all fell silent, listening. A faint rustling came from the tree line, followed by a soft, high-pitched giggle. Lisa laughed nervously. "Okay, which one of you is messing with us?" "Not me," Eric said, his brow furrowing. Chris stood, peering into the darkness. "Probably a coyote or something. They make weird noises." "Coyotes don't giggle," Megan whispered. The sound came again, closer this time. A child's laughter, light and chilling, echoing through the still night. Lisa grabbed Megan's arm. "That's not funny." "It's not us," Megan said, her voice shaking. Chris threw another log on the fire, responding to the sudden burst of light illuminating the edge of the forest. For a split second, Megan thought she saw something. A pale face, low to the ground, staring back at them. "Inside," Chris said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. They hurried into the house, locking the doors and pulling the curtains shut. The laughter continued, circling the house now. It grew louder, interspersed with faint knocking on the windows. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" Lisa demanded, clutching a kitchen knife. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," Chris said, pacing the room. "Why not now?" Eric asked. "Because I'm not going out there in the dark," Chris snapped. They huddled in the living room, the lights on, trying to drown out the noises. The laughter eventually stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. By the time morning came, they were exhausted but relieved to see the sun. They packed quickly, eager to leave. As Chris loaded the car, Megan went to grab her phone from the kitchen counter. That's when she saw it. Written in the condensation on the window, in small, childlike handwriting, were the words, "Don't go! Megan, let's go!" Chris called from outside. She hesitated, staring at the message. Something in her gut told her to leave it alone. "Coming," she said, grabbing her phone and rushing out. They drove in tense silence, the lake house growing smaller in the rearview mirror. No one spoke until they were well down the road. "What the hell was that last night?" Lisa finally asked. No one answered. Megan didn't tell them about the writing on the window, but as they turned on to the main highway, she glanced in the side mirror and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road behind them, pale and small, its face twisted into a smile. It raised a hand and waved. The rain poured relentlessly, turning the dirt road into a slippery mess. Jenna gripped the steering wheel tightly as her car's wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. Her GPS had long since lost signal, leaving her to rely on vague directions she'd received earlier from a gas station clerk. "This place better be worth it," she muttered. She was on her way to a remote bed and breakfast tucked deep in the countryside, a weekend retreat she had booked on a whim to escape the stress of city life. The road narrowed, the trees on either side forming a dense canopy that blocked out what little light the overcast sky provided. As her headlights illuminated the twisting path, something darted across the road, a flash of pale movement that made her slam on the brakes. Her car skidded to a stop. Jenna peered into the darkness, but whatever it was had vanished. "Probably a deer," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. She pressed on, the road growing rougher with each passing mile. Just as she was beginning to wonder if she'd taken a wrong turn, the house came into view. It was an old Victorian structure, its paint peeling and windows dark. A dim porch light flickered like a dying ember. Jenna parked and dashed through the rain, her suitcase in tow. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, and after a moment, it creaked open. An older woman stood there, her face lined with age, but her smile warm. "You must be Jenna. Come in, dear. You'll catch your death out there." The inside of the house was just as dated as the exterior. The furniture was antique, the air heavy with the scent of wood polish and something faintly metallic. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Holloway, the proprietor, and showed Jenna to her room at the top of a narrow staircase. "You're our only guest this weekend," Mrs. Holloway said with a small smile. "The rain has kept everyone else away, but don't worry, you'll be perfectly safe here." Jenna nodded, though something about the way Mrs. Holloway said "safe" made her stomach twist. That night, as the storm raged outside, Jenna lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house creaked and groaned with age, and every so often she thought she heard faint footsteps in the hallway. She told herself it was just Mrs. Holloway. At some point, she drifted off to sleep. A loud bang jolted her awake. She sat up, heart racing, straining to hear over the sound of the rain. The noise came again, this time closer, a heavy, deliberate thud as if something was being dragged across the floor. "Mrs. Holloway?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Jenna slipped out of bed, grabbing her phone for light. She opened the door and peered into the dark hallway. The air felt colder out here, almost biting. The sound came again, louder now, from downstairs. Against her better judgment, Jenna crept toward the staircase. She paused at the top, shining her phone's flashlight into the gloom below. At first, she saw nothing. Then, her light caught movement, a shadow slipping out of sight into a room to the left. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. She waited, but the only answer was the sound of the rain pounding against the windows. Jenna descended the stairs, her footsteps hesitant. The house seemed larger now, the walls stretching impossibly tall. She reached the bottom and turned toward the room where she'd seen the shadow. It was the dining room. The long table was set for a meal, though the plates were covered in dust and the silverware tarnished. At the far end of the room stood a figure. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall and thin, its back to her. Its clothes were old-fashioned, tattered, and soaked as though it had just come in from the rain. "Mrs. Holloway?" she whispered, though she already knew it wasn't her. The figure began to turn. Jenna's flashlight flickered, and for a moment she saw its face, gaunt, pale, with eyes like hollow voids. The light went out. Jenna stumbled backward, fumbling with her phone, but when the flashlight came back on, the figure was gone. Her pulse thundered as she backed into the hallway. She turned to run back upstairs, but froze when she saw Mrs. Holloway standing at the foot of the staircase, her expression blank. "You shouldn't have come downstairs," Mrs. Holloway said, her voice devoid of the warmth it had held earlier. What was that?" Jenna stammered. Mrs. Holloway didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside, revealing the tall figure standing behind her. Its hollow eyes locked onto Jenna, and it began to move toward her, its footsteps slow and deliberate. Jenna ran, her heart pounding as she fled out the front door into the storm. The rain soaked her instantly, but she didn't stop. She ran to her car, fumbling with the keys as the figure emerged from the house, its movements impossibly fast now, closing the distance between them. She managed to get the door open and threw herself inside, locking it just as the figure reached the window. Its face pressed against the glass, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. Jenna screamed as she started the car and peeled away, the tires spinning on the wet road. She didn't stop driving until she reached the gas station she'd passed earlier. When she finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, the road behind her was empty. But the reflection in the mirror wasn't. The road to the cabin was a narrow, winding path cutting through dense woods. Miles of shadowy trees stretched on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Alex and his friends, Mark, Jenna, and Beth, had rented the secluded place for the weekend, eager for an escape from the noise of city life. As they arrived, the cabin loomed out of the darkness. It was old, with warped wooden walls and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. A single light flickered above the front door. "Quaint," Jenna said sarcastically, stepping out of the car and eyeing the place. "It has character," Alex replied, grabbing the keys from his pocket. Inside, the cabin was simple. A living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The air was musty, and the floorboards creaked with every step. They spent the first night playing cards by the fire, laughing and drinking. But as the hours stretched on, the laughter began to fade. Something about the cabin felt off, though none of them wanted to admit it. It started small, faint noises from the walls, like scratching or tapping. "Probably just mice," Beth said, though she sounded unconvinced. Later, Mark swore he saw movement in the hallway, but when Alex checked, the space was empty. They brushed it off and went to bed. Alex woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was faint but persistent, like someone humming a soft, tuneless melody. He sat up, straining to hear. It was coming from outside. He crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then his eyes adjusted and he froze. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle as if it were listening. The humming stopped. The figure turned slowly toward the cabin, and Alex stumbled back, his heart pounding. The next morning, Alex told the others what he'd seen. "Probably just a shadow," Mark said, though he avoided looking out the windows. But the unease lingered. The group decided to go for a hike to clear their heads, leaving the cabin behind. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent. As they walked, Jenna stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They listened. Faintly, in the distance, the humming began again. Beth grabbed Alex's arm. "That's what you heard last night, isn't it?" Before Alex could answer, Mark called out, "Guys, over here!" He was standing near a tree, pointing to something carved into the bark. The words were jagged and uneven, as if etched by trembling hands. "Leave." "Okay, this is officially creepy," Jenna said, backing away. The humming grew louder. It was closer now, echoing through the trees. "Let's go back," Alex said, his voice firm. They hurried back to the cabin, but as they approached, something was off. The door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. "I locked that," Alex said, his stomach sinking. Inside, the cabin was cold. The fire they had left smoldering in the fireplace was out, and the air smelled faintly of rot. "What's that?" Beth whispered, pointing to the floor. Dark footprints trailed across the wooden boards, leading from the front door to the hallway. They were large and bare, with long, claw-like impressions at the toes. "We're leaving," Alex said, grabbing the car keys. They piled into the car, hearts racing, but as Alex turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again and again, but the car wouldn't start. "Come on," Mark shouted, pounding the dashboard. The humming returned, louder than ever, coming from all directions now. Jenna screamed as a shadow passed by the window, too fast to be human. "They're surrounding us," Beth whispered to Dad, her voice trembling. The figures emerged from the woods, their pale, elongated forms moving unnaturally. They circled the car, their heads tilting and twisting as if studying their prey. One of them pressed its face against the window. Its skin was gray and stretched tight over its skull, its eyes black voids that seemed to suck in the light. It smiled. The glass shattered. Days later, the authorities found the cabin. The car was still parked out front, its doors open. Inside, they found signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, deep gouges in the walls. But the four friends were never found. The only clue was a message carved into the wooden floor of the cabin, scratched deep and uneven. "Stay away." The storm had rolled in quickly, turning what was supposed to be a scenic drive into a tense crawl through blinding rain. Lily gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. She had decided to take the scenic route back home from visiting her family, a stretch of highway that cut through miles of remote farmland. The plan had been to enjoy the open road and clear her head. Instead, she found herself squinting into the darkness, the headlights barely piercing the sheets of rain. The GPS signal had vanished an hour ago, leaving her with only a vague sense of direction. The fields on either side of the road seemed endless, punctuated occasionally by broken-down barns or lonely clusters of trees. Then out of nowhere, she saw it, a figure standing at the side of the road, drenched and motionless. Lily's foot hovered over the brake, her heart racing. She slowed, squinting through the rain. It was a man, his clothes soaked and clinging to his thin frame. He wasn't waving for help or trying to flag her down. He was just standing there, staring as her car approached. Something about him felt off. His posture was too rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Lily drove past him, her pulse pounding. In the rearview mirror, she could see him still standing there, watching her until the darkness swallowed him up. The rain didn't let up and the road seemed to stretch on forever. Just as she began to wonder if she'd missed a turn, her headlights caught something ahead. Another figure. Her stomach dropped. It was the same man, standing in the same eerie pose, drenched and staring. "No way," she whispered, her hands gripping the wheel tighter. She drove past him again, faster this time, refusing to look in the mirror. Her rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a different person, a trick of the rain and shadows, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Minutes later, her car began to sputter. The engine coughed, the dashboard lights flickered, and the vehicle slowed to a crawl. "No, no, no," Lily muttered, hitting the gas, but the car coasted to a stop. She sat there, gripping the wheel, the rain hammering against the roof. She didn't want to get out. Not here, not now, but she had no choice. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. With a deep breath, she pulled her hood over her head and stepped out into the storm. The rain was colder than she expected, soaking through her jacket almost instantly. She popped the hood and leaned over the engine, pretending she knew what she was looking for. A flash of movement caught her eye. She froze, her breath fogging in the cold air. Slowly, she turned her head. The man was standing in the field beside the road, closer than before. His head tilted further this time, as if he were studying her. Lily slammed the hood shut and scrambled back into the car, locking the doors. She fumbled with the keys, praying the engine would start, but it only groaned in response. Outside, the man took a step closer, and then another. He moved slowly, deliberately, his soaked clothes clinging to his unnaturally thin frame. Lily hit the horn, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he stopped and raised his hand, pointing directly at her. Her phone buzzed suddenly, lighting up the screen. For a brief moment, she thought she'd regained signal, but when she looked, the screen was blank, just static. Then a message appeared. "Get out!" The car's radio turned on by itself, blasting a burst of static before settling into a low, distorted hum. A voice crackled through, faint and fragmented. "You shouldn't be here." Lily's eyes darted back to the field. The man was gone. But when she looked ahead, he was standing in the middle of the road. She screamed, slamming her foot on the gas. The engine roared to life and the car lurched forward. The man didn't move, didn't flinch as she sped toward him. At the last second, she swerved, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The car spun, the world tilting as it careened off the road and into the field. When the car finally stopped, Lily was shaking, her hands trembling on the wheel. She looked around, the rain blurring everything outside. The man was gone, or so she thought. A loud thud came from the roof of the car. Then another. Lily's breath caught in her throat as something heavy began to scrape across the metal. She didn't dare look up, her heart pounding in her chest. The scraping stopped. Slowly, ever so slowly, she turned her head to the driver's side window. The man was there, inches away, his hollow eyes staring in. He smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp, and then the window shattered. When the authorities found her car the next morning, it was abandoned, the driver's side door hanging open. The vehicle was covered in long, deep scratches, as if something with claws had dragged them across the metal. Lily was never found. But on particularly stormy nights, drivers on that lonely stretch of road have reported seeing a figure standing in the rain, watching them pass. The weekend retreat was supposed to be an escape, a rented cabin deep in the woods, away from work, stress, and endless notifications. Jessica, her boyfriend Ethan, and their two friends, Megan and Ryan, were looking forward to a few days of peace. No cell service, no distractions, just nature and relaxation. The cabin was picturesque but isolated, surrounded by dense trees and a small lake glinting in the afternoon light. The landlord, an older man with a weathered face, handed them the keys and gave a cryptic warning as he left. Stay inside after dark, and whatever you do, don't go down to the lake at night. They all exchanged amused glances. It sounded like the setup for a bad horror movie. Got it, Grandpa. No swimming under the stars, Ethan joked. The man didn't laugh. He just shook his head and left without another word. The first day passed without incident. They spent it exploring the woods, cooking over an open fire, and playing card games by the crackling fireplace. As night fell, the air grew colder, and an uneasy silence settled over the forest. Jessica noticed it first. Do you guys hear that? Hear what? Ryan asked. Exactly, she replied. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Ethan brushed it off. We're just not used to how quiet it is out here. City life messes with your head. But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, Jessica woke up to a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it pulled her from her dreams, a soft splashing like someone walking through shallow water. She sat up, her heart thudding in her chest. The others were still asleep, their breathing slow and steady. Curiosity overpowered her fear, and she crept to the window. The lake was barely visible through the trees, but in the pale moonlight, she saw movement, a figure wading into the water. It was hard to make out details, but the person looked wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky, as though they weren't used to their body. Jessica stepped back from the window, her pulse racing. She thought about waking the others, but stopped. What would she say? That she saw someone near the lake? It sounded ridiculous. She convinced herself it was just her imagination and went back to bed. The next morning, Jessica mentioned what she'd seen. You probably just dreamed it, Megan said, sipping her coffee. Or it was a deer or something, Ethan added. Jessica nodded, but she wasn't convinced. They spent the day hiking further into the woods, trying to shake off the weirdness of the night. But even in the daylight, something felt off. The forest seemed too quiet, and shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. On the way back to the cabin, Megan stopped suddenly. What's that? She asked, pointing to the ground. They all leaned in to see. It was a trail of wet footprints leading away from the lake, deep and oddly shaped, like whatever made them wasn't fully human. Ethan forced a laugh. Probably a prank, someone trying to mess with us. But nobody else laughed. That night, the sound of splashing returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Jessica sat up, her stomach churning with dread. Then came the knocking. It was slow and deliberate, a heavy thud against the cabin door. Who the hell is that? Ethan whispered, already pulling on his jeans. Don't answer it, Jessica hissed, grabbing his arm. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. The wood of the door groaned as though under immense pressure. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the window. He peeked out, and his face went pale. What is it? Megan asked, her voice shaking. Ryan didn't answer. He just stepped back, shaking his head. Ryan, what did you see? They're out there, he whispered. Who's out there? Jessica demanded. I don't know, he said, his voice trembling. But they're not normal. Before anyone could respond, the door burst open, slamming against the wall. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light around the room. Standing in the doorway was a figure soaked to the bone, its skin gray and slick like it had been underwater for far too long. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to draw in the light. Behind it, more figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies contorted and dripping with lake water. Megan screamed, and the figures moved. The next morning, the landlord returned to check on the cabin. The front door was wide open, hanging from one hinge. Inside, the furniture was overturned, deep gouges marking the walls and floors. There was no sign of the four friends. Down by the lake, the water rippled unnaturally, though there was no wind. Something moved just beneath the surface. A hint of gray flesh, a glint of hollow black eyes. And if you stood there long enough, you could hear it. Soft, rhythmic knocking, like a warning to anyone foolish enough to stay. The drive through the mountains was supposed to be the highlight of their weekend getaway. Emma and her boyfriend Lucas had planned the trip for months. A cabin rental deep in the wilderness, disconnected from the world. It was meant to be romantic, serene, and an escape from the grind of their everyday lives. The first sign of trouble came when their GPS cut out. Lucas shrugged it off, relying on printed directions he'd downloaded just in case. But as they wound deeper into the forest, the narrow road became more treacherous, the towering trees pressing closer and closer. The second sign was the weather. What had been a sunny autumn afternoon quickly turned into an ominous storm. Dark clouds rolled in, and fat raindrops splattered against the windshield. The dirt road turned to mud, and visibility dropped as fog seeped through the trees. "Are we even close?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with unease. Lucas squinted at the faded map. Should be just a few more miles. But as the rain intensified, the road became nearly impassable. The tires slipped in the mud, and the trees on either side seemed to lean in, their skeletal branches scratching against the car. That's when they saw the figure. A woman stood on the side of the road, soaked to the bone. Her long black hair clung to her face, and she wore a tattered dress that looked out of place in the cold, wet forest. She didn't wave for help or move toward the car. She simply stared at them as they passed. Emma turned in her seat to watch her disappear into the fog. "Did you see her face?" Lucas shook his head. "No. Did you?" Emma hesitated. "No. But I think she was smiling." When they finally reached the cabin, it was nothing like the pictures online. The structure was old, leaning slightly to one side as if it had weathered decades of storms. The windows were fogged over, and the front door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "This can't be right," Emma said, clutching her jacket against the cold. Lucas checked the address. "It's the one. Let's just make the best of it." Reluctantly, they carried their bags inside. The interior was even worse than the outside. Dust-covered furniture, a faint smell of mildew, and strange stains on the wooden floor. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. They tried to settle in, lighting a fire and unpacking, but the unease lingered. It didn't help that every so often Emma thought she heard something, a faint knock like someone tapping on the windows, or a soft whisper carried on the wind. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Lucas shook his head. "It's just the storm. Relax." But Emma couldn't relax, not when the whispers grew louder. That night, Emma woke to the sound of footsteps. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was faint but deliberate, moving from the living room to the hallway outside their bedroom. "Lucas," she whispered, shaking him awake. He groaned. "What?" "Someone's in the cabin." Lucas sat up listening. The footsteps had stopped. "You probably just heard the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma didn't argue. She knew what she'd heard. They stayed awake, listening, but the cabin remained silent until the knocking started. It was slow, deliberate, and coming from the front door. "Stay here," Lucas said, grabbing the flashlight. "Are you insane? Don't open it." But Lucas had already crept into the hallway. Emma clutched the blanket, her heart pounding as she listened to him move toward the door. "Hello?" Lucas called. The knocking stopped. A long silence followed before Lucas spoke again. "There's no one here." Then came his scream. Emma jumped out of bed, running into the hallway. Lucas was on the floor, clutching his arm. The flashlight rolled across the floor, its beam illuminating the door, now scratched and splintered as though something with claws had been trying to get in. "What happened?" Emma cried, kneeling beside him. "Something grabbed me," he gasped, showing her his arm. Red bolts ran down his skin, oozing blood. They barricaded the door and huddled by the fire, too scared to sleep. The storm outside raged on, the wind screaming like a living thing. And then around 3 a.m., The knocking returned. This time, it wasn't at the front door, it was at the window. Emma turned toward the sound, and her blood ran cold. The woman from the road was standing there, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her lips were pulled back in a twisted grin. "She's here," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas grabbed the flashlight, shining it at the window. But the woman was gone. The knocking moved again, this time to the back door, then to the walls, then to the ceiling. It was everywhere, surrounding them, closing in. "What does she want?" Emma cried, clutching Lucas. The whispers began again, louder this time, as if a dozen voices were speaking at once. The words were garbled, unintelligible, but filled with malice. And then the fire went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and the air grew icy. In the faint glow of the flashlight, Emma saw movement, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, its limbs impossibly long. "Run," Lucas whispered, grabbing her hand, but before they could move, the figure lunged. The cabin was found days later, abandoned and in disarray. The furniture was overturned, deep scratches covered the walls, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. Emma and Lucas were never seen again. Locals say the forest is cursed, that the woman in the woods is a restless spirit seeking vengeance. And if you're ever driving through the mountains on a stormy night, they say you might see her standing by the side of the road, smiling. The abandoned lighthouse stood on a desolate stretch of rocky coast, a place long forgotten by time and people. Its towering silhouette loomed against the evening sky as Claire and her friends, Mike, Sarah, and Eric, trudged up the crumbling path toward it. They had been drawn by rumors. Strange lights at night, ghostly figures in the windows, and an eerie fog that never seemed to lift. "I can't believe we're doing this," Sarah muttered, hugging her jacket tighter against the biting wind. Mike grinned. "Come on, it's just a lighthouse. What's the worst that could happen?" Eric, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "It's a tourist trap. Somebody probably set this up for cheap thrills." But Claire couldn't shake the chill in her gut. She hadn't wanted to come, but the group had insisted. Now, standing at the base of the lighthouse, she couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. The heavy wooden door groaned as Mike pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of seawater and decay. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the spiral staircase leading upward disappeared into shadows. "This place is a death trap," Sarah said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Only one way to find out," Mike said, starting up the staircase. As they climbed, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt thick, pressing against their chests with each step. The dim light from their flashlights cast eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Claire was the last in line, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. She glanced back repeatedly, but saw nothing. "Are we almost there?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with nerves. "Just a few more steps," Mike called from above. They reached the top of the staircase and entered the lantern room. The glass panes were fogged and streaked with grime, but the view of the stormy sea below was breathtaking. "There's your haunted lighthouse," Eric said, leaning against the railing. "Looks like nobody's been here in decades." But as he spoke, a faint glow appeared in the corner of the room. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered. The light grew brighter, forming a sphere that hovered in the air. It pulsed, casting an unnatural glow that made their shadows dance wildly across the walls. Mike reached out to touch it, and Claire grabbed his arm. "Don't!" But it was too late. The moment his fingers brushed the light, the room went dark. When the light returned, they weren't in the lighthouse anymore. The room had changed. Gone were the rusted railings and cracked glass. Instead, the walls were pristine, the lantern above burning with a steady golden glow. The storm outside had vanished, replaced by an eerie calm. "What just happened?" Eric said, his voice trembling. Claire's heart pounded. "I don't think we're alone." Footsteps echoed from the staircase, slow and deliberate. The sound sent a jolt of terror through them all. "Who's there?" Mike shouted, but no one answered. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the room. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man in an old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's uniform, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. Sarah screamed, and the man lunged. Chaos erupted as they scrambled to escape. The staircase seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. No matter how far they ran, they couldn't reach the bottom. The keeper's laughter echoed all around them, mingling with the sounds of the sea crashing against the rocks. "This isn't real," Eric shouted, but his voice wavered with fear. "It's real enough," Claire said, her breaths coming in gasps. They finally burst through a door, spilling into a narrow corridor that hadn't been there before. The walls were lined with old photographs, each one showing the lighthouse keeper standing with a group of visitors. Claire froze when she recognized the faces in the most recent picture. It was them. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the corridor stretched on endlessly, twisting and looping until it became impossible to tell where they'd started. Doors appeared on either side, but when they opened them, they only led back into the same corridor. "We're trapped," Sarah sobbed, collapsing to the floor. The lights began to flicker, and the walls trembled. The keeper's voice rang out, low and mocking. "None of you will leave. You belong to the lighthouse now." The group huddled together, their flashlights flickering uselessly. Shadows began to creep along the walls, taking on shapes, figures with twisted limbs and hollow eyes. One by one, the shadows reached for them. Eric was the first to go, dragged screaming into the darkness. Then Sarah, her cries echoing until they abruptly stopped. Mike grabbed Claire's hand, his grip tight. "We have to fight it!" But the shadows were relentless, and Mike's grip slipped away. Claire was alone. When Claire woke, she was lying at the base of the lighthouse, the storm raging around her. There was no sign of the others. She stumbled to her feet, her body aching, and looked back at the lighthouse. Its windows were dark, its silhouette as foreboding as ever. But as she turned to leave, she saw the new photograph on the lighthouse door. There she was, standing beside the keeper, her eyes hollow and black. And as the storm swallowed her, she heard the whispers again. "None of you will leave."